All right, welcome back, everyone. We are now on to our second panel, which is on contested and negotiated publics in South Asian political society. And our moderator for this panel is Professor Audrey Trishka. Audrey Trishka is Associate Professor of South Asian History at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. Her research interests cover from pre-modernity into modern times, often emphasizing Hindu-Muslim interactions, cultural history, and the politics of the past. And I'll turn it over to Audrey now and look forward to another fabulous panel, I'm sure.
Thank you very much. May I extend a warm welcome to everyone, of course, to our fantastic panelists. I'll be introducing in a moment, and of course, to our audience. So the title of this panel is Contested and Negotiated Publics in South Asian Political Society. And we have three wonderful panelists joining us. I'm going to introduce them all now, and then we'll just go in this order. So speaking first will be Dr. Shobhana Xavier, who is Assistant Professor of Religion and Diaspora in the School of Religion at Queen's University in Canada. She is the author of one book, co-author of another book. She's the sole author of Sacred Spaces and Transnational Networks, Bawa Mohayedin and Contemporary Shrine Cultures, that came out in 2018. And she is the co-author of Contemporary Sufism, Piety, Politics, and Popular Culture, that was published in 2017. She thinks and writes on contemporary Sufism, including in Sri Lanka. And she'll be talking, I think, about that to us today. Her paper is titled Public as Space, the Possibilities and Contestations of Sufi Shrines in Sri Lanka. Next up will be Dr. Athar Zia, who is a political anthropologist, poet, short fiction writer, and a columnist. She's Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology and the Gender Studies program at the University of Northern Colorado, Greeley. Dr. Zia is the author of Resisting Disappearances, Military Occupation and Women's Activism in Kashmir. The title of her talk today is The Kashmir Dispute and the Question of Faith. Last but not least, joining us is Dr. Nicholas Witkowski, who is Assistant Professor in the History of Religion at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Man, it's really late. It's really late for you. Dr. Witkowski received his PhD in Religious Studies at Stanford University. His current project, Lifestyles of Impurity, is a study of low and outcast communities in first millennium South Asia that employs the theoretical armature of historians of the everyday. And his talk today is titled Untouchability, the Cultures of Death and the Configuration of Communal Identity in Medieval Indian Buddhist Monasticisms. And so with that, I turn over the floor to our three panelists, beginning with Dr. Shobhana Xavier.
I'm just gonna share my screen. Great. Folks can see it. So thumbs up. Yeah, great. Okay. Thank you so much, Audrey, for the introduction, and thank you, Rohit, for organizing such a wonderful two-day conference. And it's a pleasure to be in community with folks, even if it's virtually. Been enjoying hearing your at least the first panel. It was great. So I'm presenting some work that's in progress and something that I've been thinking about in terms of field work since 2011. I come and go to this space partly because Sri Lanka is a challenging space to navigate fieldwork in, so it's often difficult to maintain sustained fieldwork in a space, especially around politicized spaces. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and probably you'll get a sense of why some of the fieldwork that I do here is challenging. Most of my work is invested in or interested in thinking about contemporary Sufism, and so I've thought a lot about it in the North American context and continue to do so. And the Sri Lankan context kind of emerged as a byproduct of my engagement in the North American context, partly because there's a Tamil Sufi teacher that's buried in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, whose origins is in northern Sri Lanka and Jaffna. And so that's the story that essentially led me to thinking about Sri Lanka broadly, which then resulted in this particular project. And so what I've been doing is thinking a lot about the way in which Sufi shrines exist in the contemporary moment. And I'm amongst South Asianists, so many of you quite know about maybe the Sri Lankan context, but I'll just say a little bit in terms of why I think Sufi shrines are kind of situated in a unique situation in the context of Sri Lanka. Like most nation state projects, Sri Lanka obviously went through the process of independence from Britain, but I think what has informed or been challenging in the project of nation building has been these fault lines around linguistic identities that have gone on to define ethnic identities. At times, religion has accented or amplified these fault lines. And so a lot of this is really embedded around language. So if you speak Sinhala or if you speak Tamil, and then also in terms of oddly for Muslim communities, religiosity, so being Muslim is itself an ethnic identity. So there's a lot of majority-minority politics that has informed the Sri Lankan context, which eventually led to, in the 1980s, to a civil war that only ended in 2009. So this has been quite recent. The civil war was between kind of Tamil rebel militant organization, the Tamil Tigers, and also the nation state, which kind of has embodied this kind of Sinhala Buddhist identity, which I could speak a lot more about in the Q&A. So this is kind of the context. So even though the war ended and it's kind of assumed that the separatist cause of the Tamil people, which was essentially meant to kind of seek sovereignty, ended, what is meant post 2009 is that there's a new scapegoat, right? There's a new idea of a minority in which to construct the nation state against, and part of that new community has essentially been Muslims, right? Muslim here both as an ethnic identity, but also religious identity. So there's been instances since 2009 that's resulted in kind of showcasing the precarity of Muslim communities. And this has often been positioned of extremist Buddhist communities that have been targeting Muslim communities, particularly through spaces, but also sometimes through businesses and homes. And so there's been a series of communal violence that have emerged, unfortunately has been the historical reality of Sri Lanka. And we see these in instances, right? So recently during COVID, for instance, there was a mandate from the Sri Lankan government to cremate everybody who died of COVID. And this was obviously challenging, particularly to Muslim communities who do not practice cremation. So there was kind of an international outcry, and a lot of the resistance and international support came from some Arab Gulf countries who are trying to push against this, and this was only rescinded in last year around this time, right? The incident that I think has also challenged a lot of this is also the Easter bombings that took place in 2019, which were tied to individuals, Muslims who affirmed ties to ISIS, which further kind of created this idea that Muslims are a group that we need to pay attention to. They are, the typical Islamophobic stereotypes that so many people are accustomed to in the West, which is embedded within a growing Buddhist nationalism. So this is kind of the political context in which I'm thinking about some of these Sufi shrine spaces. And so I'm thinking about Sufi shrines in Sri Lanka, partly because of this context, but also because I'm interested in thinking about issues of mobility, movement, networks across the Indian Ocean. So for instance, to the West in the Arab Gulf, and to the East to the Malay world and the Southeast Asian world, right? And there's been a lot of amazing literature that's been written about it and historicizing the networks here. And so because my investment has been in sacred spaces, I've been drawn more and more to sacred spaces, particularly Sufi shrines in Sri Lanka, because I find them embedded in a very precarious context that is based on territorial rights to nationalism, but also these other possibilities, right? Access to women, ritual, and ethnic pluralism in a context of kind of a space in which communal violence is quite common. So I'll signal to some of this. Obviously, I won't be able to engage all of them fully, but hopefully this will give a sense of the broader conversation that this panel is hoping to have. And I'm happy to come back to some of this in the Q&A. So in the context of Sri Lanka, when I'm thinking about Sufi spaces, I often start with Adam's Peak, partly because this is the space that has been of interest to many folks across Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, and Christian communities. Adam's Peak, or Sripada, is conceived today or as constructed today as a predominantly Buddhist space. But we know historically from a lot of writings, from Arab writers, from South Asian Muslim writers, that Adam's Peak also had a particular connotation, specifically cosmologically for Muslims. We see that Ibn Battuta, for instance, traveled to Ceylon or Serendib just to make the pilgrimage. And in his travel logs, he writes about encountering dervishes along the way as much as yogis, right, in different shrines. And so because of this allure of Adam's Peak, essentially that the prophet Adam was expelled from paradise, and in the process of expulsion landed in Sri Lanka or Serendip or in the Indian Ocean, right? There's different kind of mappings of this, and his partner Eve was displaced to Jeddah, and they eventually reunited and started humanity here, right? So there's this narrative that becomes very significant for Muslims, which over time has kind of been purged or silenced, right? There's less and less presence of this narrative even today. This is a huge tourist attraction, and it's predominantly walked by Buddhists today. But why Adam's Peak is important is that I think that it then becomes a base in which a Sufi pilgrimage network gets constructed where there's other spaces, right? So another famous one is Dr. Jilani and then Qatragama. So I kind of conceive of these as the major ones. Dr. Jilani is attributed to Abdul Qadir Jilani, who was a 12th century Baghdadi theologian and Sufi. And there's this kind of narrative in South India, but also in Sri Lanka, that there's this period of 11 years where he kind of goes away or is accounted for. And there's a sense that he kind of traveled. And one of the places he essentially traveled to was, maybe South India, but also in Sri Lanka, where then a hermitage site or kind of a jungle-based Sufi shrine was constructed for him. And there's lots of mythologies, and subsequent Sufis or individuals have been entombed in this open air kind of shrine space. What this means, though, is that these Sufi spaces sometimes end up being constructed or claimed by other folks, right? And in the context of Sri Lanka, Dr. Jilani, for instance, which Sufis hold is this important site associated with Abdul Qadir Jilani, is also a Buddhist hermitage site, or they understand as Karagala. And so these kind of moments of tension highlight how kind of issues of ownership, territorial rights come up. And this one space, Dr. Jilani, has been written about quite a bit, and a lot of folks have highlighted how it has gone back and forth using kind of archaeological work to prove who owns this space, who is legitimately are the inheritors of the space, with governments supporting particular Buddhist monks' claims that these are Buddhist sites and a Buddhist hermitage site before it was a Sufi or a Muslim site, right? And so this then kind of informs what happens in around these sites. So just recently, for instance, there's been kind of instances of taking away Sufi, just buildings that are on the site that are either Muslim shops or a shrine. There was a cave to kind of hither the perennial mystic that Sufis understand as this mystical figure that was taken away. And just recently they're building on top of one of the spaces to hopefully claim it as, this is a Buddhist hermitage site, and it's been supported by the government to do so. So these kind of narratives tend to be common across communities, but I think I'm noticing more and more that has a particular logic or rhetoric in the contemporary moment in post-war, partly because there's a growing anti-Muslim sentiment, right? And that's being translated into kind of targeting particular Muslim spaces that are seen legibly as Muslim by non-Muslims, in this case, individuals with particular understandings of Buddhism. The aspect that's challenging about this, and this is a point that I'll end off on, is that as some spaces are being targeted because they're Muslim spaces and it's being targeted for a particular agenda, making or constructing Sri Lanka as a Buddhist nation, within the context or amongst Muslims themselves, there's different sentiments about where Sufism is and if Sufism itself is legitimate. So I think there's a particular emergence of anti-Sufi rhetoric that also plays into this, which then results in perhaps not the same attention that's given to particular Sufi spaces when they are targeted, because some Muslims may feel that they are not legitimately Islamic spaces anyway, they're potentially heretical, so they should be kind of gotten rid of. They're a relic of an old era, right? And one of the really, really unique spaces that I've encountered during my field work work are these shrines that are long, 40-foot shrines. And these shrines are housed in kind of coastal regions around Sri Lanka, in the east, in the south. And there's this, tradition that essentially these spaces are dedicated to figures who are descendants of the prophet, because historically there's some understandings or hagiographies that relay that the prophetic figures were giants, right? And so individuals historically were giants, and humanity regressed because they were morally or ethically not strong human beings anymore, and they shrunk in size. And so because of this, the idea of these long shrines are not Padimola, it's just essentially 40 feet long shrines that are dedicated to saintly figures, are kind of found everywhere. But what you'll find is when you go to these spaces are often kind of not taken care of and kind of shut. Actually, most of them are shut down. And so in this picture, you'll see that when you do go to the shrine, you're supposed to call the phone numbers that are on the board, and the local community is supposed to come and open it up. But most of these places do end up being shut down. And when you do call, the numbers are out of service. Same with these are spaces that some Muslim communities in localized regions, Muslim councils don't want you visiting because they see them potentially as heretical sites. Despite this, people still go, Muslims, non-Muslims, women particularly, go to these spaces and access them, light incense, and do venerate at these sites, right? So essentially, I'm kind of interested in thinking about Sufi shrines as wedged between a particular Buddhist nationalism, but also thinking about how they're being perceived or not supported by other Muslims who are espousing more and more anti-Sufi sentiments. So I will leave it at that. I think that's about 10 minutes, but yeah. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I found that really interesting. And I think it's very useful to be so grounded in this sort of physical space. And so now we move from Sri Lanka all the way up to Kashmir. Dr. Athar Zia, the floor is yours. But just briefly before I do, folks, we are utilizing the Q&A function for questions. Okay, most of you don't need this reminder, but a few of you apparently do. Absolutely no bigotry of any form will be tolerated in those Q&A.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for moderating the panel, and thank you, Rohit, for inviting me to this panel. So this paper is an early draft of something that I'm currently working on, so all feedback, suggestions are welcome. The paper is titled Kashmir Dispute and the Question of Faith. And although I talk about this in the paper, but I do want to say that this was spurred on in September when one of the leaders of the Kashmiri resistance movement, he passed away, Sayyid Ali Gilani. So he's mentioned in the paper, and his ideology as well. And I thought this was the perfect panel to kind of talk about these ideas and get some feedback, as well as just write this down and capture it. And I know that Rohit is pushing us to send the draft, and hopefully I'll have something for him at the end of the day. So the paper is titled Kashmir Dispute and the Question of Faith. I'm going to read some of the stuff here, and this is distilled from the larger paper, and I hope it all makes sense. And if I feel that something is missing, I might supply those subsections or the things that I'm kind of arguing in some places, because I didn't take all of it. In the Indian national narrative, this first section is titled The Muslim Problem. In the Indian national narrative, even before the Bharatiya Janata Party took over, Kashmiri Tehreek was depicted as a Kashmir, quote unquote, Islamic or Muslim problem. This had a few key ramifications for the Kashmiri Tehreek, as the resistance is known in Kashmir. One, under the increasingly anti-Islamic world order, especially after post 9/11, it made it easier to subsume Kashmiri resistance under the Irana stereotype of Islamic terrorism. It also added more fuel to the fire of Pakistani support that Kashmiri movement was already carrying. However, we must ask, how is Kashmir dispute a Muslim issue, or whose Muslim issue is it? Going further back to even ask, what makes an issue Muslim or Islamic? Was the end goal of the Kashmiri Tehreek dominantly peopled by Muslims to establish an independent sovereignty seen as Islamic/Muslim issue, or was it, if perceived from the opposite vantage, that Kashmir was dominantly Muslim and key to establish the plurality of Indian nation state, and thus a Muslim issue? This question also becomes key in the current unfolding scenario where Kashmir's quasi-autonomy was stripped in 2019, and Kashmir's Muslim population is facing its long-held fears. Not just the threat or slow unfolding, but active settler colonial policies that they had been fearing right from when Indian client regimes engineered accession to India and solidified it in 1949 through Article 370. Currently in India, the ideology of Hindu indigeneity, which casts Muslims living in India and those in Kashmir as invaders and foreigners, has taken a firm hold. In that equation, Kashmiri Muslims are doubly marked as the demonized other, first as Muslims and second as Kashmiris who are long-standing dissidents fighting India. The erasure of Kashmir's autonomy and the demographic changes that ensued have been part of RSS's rallying cries since 1947. Kashmir's special autonomous status was seen as an appeasement of Muslims in this region and a threat to Indian ethno-nationalism. However, all Indian governments from the outset have engineered a steady erosion of Kashmir's autonomy with the aim of absorbing the region, irrespective of the Kashmiri demand for a plebiscite and independence from India. The BJP's Kashmir solution, which was, of course, that was one of the terms that was used by some of the people during the 2019 episode, has brazen hyper-religious and nationalistic roots entrenched in Hindu supremacy and ethno-nationalism. This enterprise is fully fueled by the neoliberal order that aims to sustain India as a modern neo-colonial force. This subsection is titled Not Kashmir's, but India's Muslim Problem. In this context, it becomes crucial to bring into focus analysis proffered by key members of Kashmiri political resistance front known as the Hurriyat, which is a conglomerate of 28 parties. Of course, it's almost banned by now. Almost redeemed in the current moment, these key members opined that Indian government's focus right from 1947 had been to dilute the Muslim nature of the region by settler colonial policies, and thus it was not Kashmir's Muslim problem, but India's Muslim problem. This was said to me by Sayyid Ali Gilani in the interviews I did with him between 2010 and 2015. One of the most vocal proponents of this ideology, Sayyid Ali Gilani, was known by various unforgiving names in the Indian media: a hawk, a hardliner, an extremist, etc. To Kashmiris, he was a teacher, journalist, a prolific writer, chairman of All Parties Hurriyat Conference, the conglomerate I spoke about, former head of the Jamaat-e-Islami, and also a new faction of the Hurriyat called the Tehreek-e-Hurriyat, which was a breakaway faction. His writings carry the earliest analysis of India's designs as an imperial settler colonial state. Even though a proponent of accession to Pakistan, which he envisioned as the land of Islam, Gilani was not a votary of Kashmiri identitarian politics. His works provide the earliest counter to Indian and Kashmiri client political outfits that propagated India as a uniquely secular state. In each phase of the Kashmiri movement, he counters National Conference, a pro-India political outfit that propagated India as uniquely secular, despite its own leaders suffering coups, incarcerations, and exile at the hands of Indian establishment. Sayyid Ali Gilani died in September 21. It was an important moment for Kashmiris of all political opinions. His death became a spectacle of Indian necropolitics. Gilani had been under house arrest for the last 11 years. On and off, he roughly spent 20 years of his life in prison and survived close to 12 assassination attempts on his life. The Indian government did not allow the funeral and went to the extent of desecrating and manhandling the body and his family members as well. Several of his family members were arrested and are still detained. To Kashmiris, Gilani was Bab, or father, or Qayad, or leader, and his figure spoke to people across all political shades. Gilani had a staunch pro-Pakistan stance and rejected the idea of independent Kashmir. However, he believed that all Kashmiris were primarily united in fighting against the Indian occupation. Even though he dreamed of joining Pakistan and having a greater autonomy within the boundaries of that Islamic nation, he believed that if it did not happen, independence was always a preferable option over Indian imperialism. And this was the mandate of one of what India considered as the hawk of Kashmiri resistance. This subsection is titled The Ideal of Kashmiri Jihad. From 1989 onwards, when the armed resistance began, Indian political establishment pushed the narrative that Kashmiri movement was out to establish an Islamic state. The earliest resistance movement was dominated by the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, or the JKLF. This organization was founded by Kashmiri exiles in Birmingham, UK in 1977, with branches in UK, of course, Europe, USA, and Middle East. In 1982, 2 centers were started in Azad Kashmir, and 1 in Jammu and Kashmir began in 1987. The JKLF actively opposed the accession of Jammu and Kashmir into either India or Pakistan and sought to reunify its territories as independent state. Islam was not at the center of their goals, and even when their ranks were dominated by Muslims, they did not see them as the main beneficiaries of when it would become an independent state, even if the numbers were higher. The JKLF in the Indian-administered Kashmir briefly took part in the armed movement from 1989 to 1994, and of course was one of its founders as well, but they gave up the arms in 1994 to resume political activism. This caused a split in the party, but their goals remained the same. This split has remained unexplored, especially in context of understanding the weaponization of religion, especially in case of Kashmiri Muslims and Pandits who had differing political vision for Kashmir. Majority of Kashmiri Muslims support independence, a sizable number support accession to Pakistan, some supported India, especially those connected to client regimes, and the Pandits dominantly identifying themselves as Indians. The persecution of Kashmiri Pandits and Muslims and non-Kashmiri Hindus and other minorities who were perceived as supporters of Indian state created a climate of fear, which led to mass migration of all these sections who were perceived to support India. The giving up of arms by JKLF, resuming an unarmed means of struggle, have not been factored into envisioning the local Kashmiri push to strengthen the secular character of Kashmiri struggle. However, from the get-go, not just from 1989, but we can move the timeline back to 1947 itself, the Kashmiri movement for independence, or even if for the plebiscite, was portrayed as a Muslim adamancy problem. The refusal to integrate with India, and this not just as a matter of conviction that Kashmiri people held, but solely attributed to Pakistani instigation. The insistence at different phases of history was that Kashmiri movement is out and out of Pakistan's proxy war, fueled by the derogatory term of the jihadist armed movement for the sake of establishing an Islamic rule. So here I kind of also talk about Hizbul Mujahideen and some of its main proponents, and also the idea of what Kashmiri Jihad means to Kashmiri militants through the lens of how Kaveri D. Berg Robinson has described it in her book, which she talks more in terms of how it's for a pluralistic state in that sense, rather than taking its ideals from what jihad is seen in Islamic jurisprudence, the political jihad, of course. And then coming to the subsection of August 5th, 2019, erasing autonomy. While the government of India has provided all shades of explanations for removal of Kashmir's autonomy, the logic of making in India a Hindu Rashtra has not surfaced much, especially when we think about Kashmir. The dominant Muslimness of Kashmir in the context of an India which is simmering in anti-Muslim and anti-minority hate must be accounted for. The lenses of xenophobia and Islamophobia are key to understanding the renewed brutal crackdown on Kashmiris, which run on Hindu supremacy and ethno-nationalism, and which are part of India's growth as a modern neo-colonial power in the region. The day the removal was announced, Hindu nationalists celebrated the event as a historic step towards establishing the Hindu Rashtra. Many Indians took to social media, taunting Kashmiris about buying land and property in Kashmir. A politician announced that the government was conducting a survey to reopen 50,000 temples, which the local Kashmiri Pandit leaders countered by noting that Kashmir never had this many temples. Indian politicians and entertainers publicly gave calls to kidnap and marry fair-skinned Kashmiri girls. This ethno-nationalistic outpouring in India was the colonial gaze manifest, one which fetishizes an occupied land and its people and perceives them as spoils of war. And this had been something that already was within the vocabulary and within the analysis of Hurriyat, especially Sayyid Ali Gilani, and he'd been writing about this for the last 40-45 years. The dilution of Muslim majority demographic of Kashmir is key to understanding the erasure of Kashmir's autonomy in this moment. With Kashmir's autonomous status gone, all laws that are Indian are automatically applicable to the region. While the sword of pandemic was swinging dangerously, the government of India unilaterally continued to change laws in Kashmir. It amended the domicile law, which opened the pathways for designated categories of Indians to become domiciles of the erstwhile stage. And that has changed further, and it has kind of opened up to everyone now. There was a fast track process which even penalizes the local authority to the tune of 50,000 Indian rupees if the domicile certificate is not issued within 15 days. This is the first time that a low-rung bureaucrat would be individually penalized by the government for not issuing paperwork within a stipulated time. Kashmiris attribute this urgency to Government of India ensuring fast-track entry of settler population, a move that constitutes what some scholars call demographic terrorism. This demographic alteration on steroids is being imposed when Kashmiris are doubly quarantined at the moment and unable to lodge protests of any kind. And the echo of going the Palestinian way is no more a fear, but a reality for many Kashmiris. I think that's where I will stop and maybe return to the question of like this being the India's Muslim problem and not Kashmir's Muslim problem in that sense in Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think it's very useful and thought-provoking for me how you sort of identify whose problem this is and consider that from different angles. Our third and final speaker in this panel, Dr. Nicholas Witkowski, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right? Great. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Okay, so I'll do my very best to keep it within the 12 minutes, but I may go a couple of minutes over. I'll try to keep it as short as possible. I know that that is the way to go here. Thank you so much, Audrey. I also want to extend my appreciation to Rohit for his generous invitation to speak at this important conference, and just say it's a privilege to be speaking alongside scholars whose work I've admired for many years. Today I'll be speaking about the title of the essay is Untouchability, Cultures of Death, and the Configuration of Communal Identity in Medieval Indian Buddhist Monasticisms. This is a project which centers on the early Buddhist community, but really much of it is an attempt to try to look for non-elite monasticisms, non-elite forms of Buddhism, something that's not typically done in Buddhist studies. Generally speaking, when we think about the earliest period or even medieval or any pre-modern Indian Buddhism. So this is an attempt to look for an entirely different kind of social demographic than one that has typically been seen before, even though it's very much a part of a religious studies project and a legal project. So generally speaking, scholars have argued that Buddhism, like other religious movements at the turn of the Common Era in South Asia, were compelled to adapt to the rise of the Brahminically administered caste system. According to this scholarly view, under the influence of an increasingly Brahminically oriented public, all religious groups, including the Buddhists, sought to marginalize, if not outright exclude, the outcast presence within their ranks. In this paper, I preview an argument from my book project that the outcast resistance to Brahminical power within the Buddhist context was actually potent enough to guarantee legal autonomy to outcast Buddhist monastic communities. Indeed, I claim that outcast legal power was substantial enough that these ostensibly subalternized communities prevailed over juridical parties which were pushing for the wholesale adoption of Brahminical purity norms within the Buddhist monastic institution. This paper discusses two traditions of law from the early centuries of the Common Era. In the first section, I discuss the characterization in the Brahminical Manava Dharma Shastra of the outcast Chandala community within the death economy as bonded laborers who were subalternized by Brahminical purity politics. According to the Manava Dharma Shastra, Brahminical law requires that the Chandala communities be confined to the death economy, and the only remuneration for their labor was the privilege of scavenging for scraps on the cremation grounds. In the second section, I'll present two passages from the Buddhist monastic legal codes, or Vinaya, which depict outcast Chandala scavengers not as mere subalterns in the Brahminical caste system, but rather as an autonomous community of religious specialists within the Buddhist context, who wielded substantial authority among the publics of early medieval South Asia. I will focus in particular on the Buddhist ascetic practice of palm shukulaka, a practice of scavenging the cremation grounds for shreds of funereal shrouds that seem to have its roots in the socioeconomic realities of outcast scavenging in the death economy. So a religious context, a group of religious practitioners doing things that look very much like outcast socioeconomic practices. So I begin with a passage on the regulation of chandalas from Book 10 of the Manavadharma Shastra. This passage states that chandalas will live outside of the village, that they are essentially confined to a certain spatial location. The garments that they wear are said to be the clothes of the dead, that is to say, this palm shukula fabric. They may go around during the day in these villages and towns, but only at the command of the king, and that they should carry away the corpses of those without relatives, firmly ensconced in this death economy. They should also always execute those condemned to death in the manner prescribed by the authoritative Brahmanical texts and at the command of the king, and that they may take the clothes, furniture, and ornaments of those condemned to death. Now, studies of subalternity generally recognize that control over bodily movement is central to the orientation of all governing regimes. Those individuals deemed subaltern, that is to say, those deemed unfit to participate in the governance of their own bodies, are subject to governance tactics that fall under the regime of spatial confinement and surveillance. Foucault has discussed these governance strategies at length in his studies of the panoptic mechanism driving early modern state formation. Here, I wish to adapt this conception of panoptic power to my analysis of the discursive strategies implied by these Brahminical jurists to assert their role as managers of nascent state structures throughout the subcontinent in the early centuries of the Common Era. In Brahminical legal codes, the jurists advocate for a panoptic mechanism of governing society, in the sense that each body's purity status is continually surveilled, categorized, and based on ritual standards set by the Brahmins themselves, ultimately confined. For the Brahminical authors of these texts, the development of protocols for the confinement of the subaltern body necessitates the mapping of social space. The Brahminical depiction of the chandala follows a cartographic pattern of dehumanization, alienation, and abstraction documented and theorized by subaltern scholarship. Line 55 of section 10 of the Manavadharma Shastra, for example, clearly stipulates that the chandala may go around during the day, but only to perform tasks performed at the behest of the king, required by the king. The outcast chandalas are prohibited from entering upper caste space unless they are performing bonded labor for the state. The last section of the passage cited above specifies that the chandala is required to carry away corpses of those without relatives and to execute those condemned to death. The legal requirement that the chandala perform these two types of labor signals not only the degraded ritual status imputed to the chandala body, but also to the locale in the Brahmanical imaginaire to which that body must perforce be confined. The Brahminical legal tradition assigns the chandala to the lowest profession in the hierarchy of ritual purity, bonded labor in the death economy. In her excellent study of ghettoized Black spaces in post-slavery America, Wayward Lives, Saidiya Hartman argues that the mapping of subject populations onto a set of spatial coordinates within the socio-political order is rooted in the desire to confine and then harness the labor of these bodies. Reading Brahminical ideology in light of Hartman's study of subalternized space, I believe we should interpret the Manavadharma Shastra's description of the chandala as a panoptic cartography of economic exploitation guaranteed by a hegemonic apparatus of socio-political confinement. Now, in the second section of the paper, I'll focus on the appearance of these outcast chandala scavenger communities within the Buddhist legal codes, or Vinaya. The Vinaya is a compendium of legal cases dealing with the transgressions of Indian Buddhist monastics. It's a highly underutilized source, though, valuable not only for articulating the social realities of Buddhist monastic life, but also, I believe, for revisioning the autonomy and socioeconomic power of outcast communities in South Asia in the first 500 years of the Common Era. In what follows below, I'll present two passages from the Buddhist monastic codes which depict outcast chandala scavengers not as mere subalterns in the Brahmanical caste system, but rather as an autonomous community of religious specialists within the Buddhist context. So the first case I'll be discussing suggests the presence of two contending legal parties within the Buddhist monastic juridical establishment. The first monastic group aimed to produce a Brahmanizing legal framework, which presumed that upper caste authorities can mobilize coercive power of the state to confine the bodies of outcasts to the ritually impure locations associated with the death economy. The second group was an anti-Brahminical monastic coalition aiming to import outcast scavenging practices into the Buddhist law codes. So I'll give everybody just a few seconds to take a read through this text, and then I'll resume discussion of it afterwards. So this passage begins with a series of rules regarding the encroachment of ritually impure monastic bodies, explicitly referred to as those of cemetery monks, on these social spaces regarded as ritually pure. This series of rules is not explicitly referred to as Brahminical, but it clearly reflects anxieties about the intrusion of the highly contaminating corpse into social space, anxieties which animate the Brahminical Dharmashastra traditions. Just as the Manavadharmashastra creates legal restrictions on the Chandala body to prevent the transmission of dangerous forces associated with the corpse into the ritually sanctified centers of society, the Vinaya jurists have compiled a list of prohibitions on this Pamshakulika body entering the sanctified social spaces, whether monastic or lay. In the Manavadharmashastra, these Brahminical rules for surveillance and control are the final word on the management of Chandala bodies. There is no dissenting opinion. But in this Vinaya case, what we find is that the rulings in the second half of the passage seem to undermine the very premise underlying the list of Brahminical purity regulations which precede them. Here, in the second half, which is highlighted in a kind of pink there, we have a reversal of the prohibition from the previous line that a cemetery monk may not enter the house of a lay patron, a powerful statement enshrined in legal principle that the authoritarian caste hierarchy sweeping South Asia could still be challenged by outcast religious communities determined to see their impure social location of marginality not as a sign of casteist or racialized inferiority, but a wellspring of religio-cultural innovation and power. In other words, there was power imputed to the low caste or outcast status of impurity for these particular bodies. They were regarded as valuable even by those across upper caste lines. The rationale for this resilience against the forces of Brahmanization may be explained by a broader sociology of the cemetery or the cremation ground in medieval Indian culture, which valorized ascetic engagement in ritually impure spaces. Rita Langer has argued in this vein that what is deemed indecent and polluted for ordinary people, such as these shrouds that were being collected, is a sign of sincerity, a badge of honor for ascetics. By this inverted social logic, the extreme impurity of the cemetery becomes the reason for its popularity among monastics. In his discussions of the Agori ascetic community of contemporary India, many of whom are from low and outcast families, Jonathan Parry has argued that these ritual professionals acquired magical technical capacities, as well as social power and prestige by systematically violating Brahminical purity norms as part of their practices involving physical engagement with corpses on the charnel ground. Thus, when the lay patron in this case states to the Buddhist cemetery ascetic, "Now I receive a great benefit, I happily receive the venerable one, this ascetic master," what we are seeing is a Brahminically oriented legal authority within the Buddhist Vinaya compelled to admit the socio-religious power that attends the body of this outcast ascetic practitioner. The final case I'll be taking a look at is significant because unlike the previous case, there is actually no Brahminical voice in the legal code at all. Please just take a moment to read through this case and then I'll briefly discuss it to conclude. So this passage is representative indeed of an entire corpus of case law in the Vinaya dealing with the acquisition, distribution, and repurposing of garments scavenged from the cremation ground. In this case, the legal regulation of the Pamshakula property, this funereal fabric, is framed within a narrative involving two parties of monks for whom scavenging on the cremation ground is just part of their everyday practice, integral to the socioeconomics of their monastic community. What is so striking about this body of law in the Vinaya is that it dramatically departs from the panoptic cartography of the Dharmashastra passage I discussed earlier. Recall that the Manava Dharmashastra depicts Chandalas as mere functionaries, stripped of all historical agency by dint of their position within the caste hierarchy. In strong contrast to the Dharmashastra depiction of the Chandalas as imprisoned within a panoptic cartography, the Vinaya views outcast ascetic communities as what I call autonomous subaltern governmentalities. Here I follow the French theorist of subalternity, Michel de Certeau, in his view that the statist panoptic cartographies of governing elites, such as Brahmins, should not be trusted. While the Brahmins envisioned the subaltern subject as ideally immobile, confined to the labor regimens of impure spaces, such as the cemetery, the Vinaya legal discourse is more consistent with a Certeauian view of the cremation ground ascetic, one which tracks the everyday mobilities far beyond the ghettoized confines at the margins of the political order. As we saw in the previous case, despite resistance from the Brahminical contingent among the Buddhist lawmakers, the Vinaya ultimately views the presence of the outcast cemetery ascetic in these ritually pure zones of upper caste spaces, including the Buddhist monastery, as normal, as conventional. These ascetic practices, which I believe are transmogrified from the socioeconomic context of the untouchable professions of the death economy, came to represent indeed a new source of power for an entrepreneurial group of outcast individuals, and a new source of power in particular for multiple medieval Indian publics who found their presence to be acceptable. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. And, oh yeah. So let me first invite our three panelists. Do any of the three of you want to react to each other before we open up for questions, starting with Shobana? Athar or Nicholas?
I do have a lot of curiosities regarding Shobana's paper, especially, when she was talking about the graves of the long graves of these saints. And I was kind of thinking about Kashmir. There are several graves like that. And one of them is also attributed to Prophet Jesus, so to speak. And I kind of thought that there was something there. So that it's just a curiosity, not a comment or an observation.
Yeah, there's so many in kind of the coastal regions, and a lot of the stories are about graves having washed onto the shores, and the different communities actually, like the Christians went up and tried to pull the grave and they couldn't do it, and then the Hindus went out and tried to pull the grave and they couldn't do it, and the Muslims succeeded, and so that's what attributed that it was a Muslim interred in the grave that they were able to pull it onto shore. I've been thinking a lot about how part of that kind of signifies the importance of Sri Lanka geographically, that the graves are washing onto the shore, and then therefore it's important broadly, like physically, but also cosmologically, and that's why I kind of tied or started the story talking about Adam, that a lot of people believe that Sri Lanka is a site that Adam was expelled to, and therefore that was what resulted in the creation of humanity when Adam and Eve were reunited. I think that narrative in the context of how Sufis adhere to it is so important in the current moment of ethno-nationalism and Buddhist hegemony on the island. But part of that is also interesting because those sites are also the sites are perceived by Muslims who are turning or being influenced more by global Salafi tendencies to see them as relics of an old Islam that are local and superstitious. So I think embedded between those two contexts of Buddhist ethno-nationalism, but also kind of growing anti-Sufism, Sufi shrines then just are these precarious sites that are these are legible as Muslim to non-Muslims and non-Islamic to Muslims. Like the legibility issue for me is the point of curiosity as well. And I think the long tombs particularly suggest like a historical legacy. Like these are supposed to be like, saints of like prophetic figures who have come to Sri Lanka, like to Ceylon, to Serendip. Why would they come here specifically, right? And so I think that and the hagiographical narrative that constitutes a particular legitimacy against the lack of legitimacy in a nation state project to me is kind of quite curious. And I'm hoping to pursue it more. And there's more and more of it. There's a particular grave in Belamanar, which is closer to the northeast to where some people believe is Adam's Bridge that connects South India to Sri Lanka. And so there's these two long graves. What's interesting about those two long graves is some Buddhist tourists believe that it's Adam and Eve. So they do like just tourism visits there and they write about it. And that just is like fascinating, partly because the Catholic Church like are caretakers of this site as well, right? So I think these are also, I don't want to present them as always sites of contestations politically, but they're also sites of ambiguity and pluralism, just because they're, as you say, they're just curious sites, right? The tour guide who took me to one of the sites was like, they're not real, right? Like he would keep telling me, even though he was a Muslim, he's like, it's not real. Like, and so he'll tell me in Tamil, and I'm like, yeah, that's okay. Like, I just want to know what people think. And so I think like for him is just like, oh, these are just relics and people just make up the stuff and there's just probably sand in there and it's not a big deal. So he would try to caution me against trying to talk about it and be like, why don't you go study other things that are important? And so there's a lot of kind of different narratives. For me, again, it's not a question of whether there's something there. I just want to know the stories. And so like you, I'm compelled by, out of curiosity about what this tells us in the broader context of the nation state and Sufi shrines broadly, right? Just not in Sri Lanka, but globally what's happening to them.
Not sure if you're encouraged to kind of like respond to that, because I know there are questions that need to be asked. But several, is that okay, Audrey, if I just briefly hop onto that comment? So several years ago, maybe soon after the BJP, or maybe before, like when PDP, the local administration in Kashmir was still ongoing and it wasn't being ruled directly by New Delhi, you had this de-radicalization project that was put into effect. And I saw it was with the police. The police was helping a local ex-bureaucrat, now a politician. He kind of led these Sufi demonstrations initially, and then he started doing this project of taking over graves and kind of constructing. So his project was de-radicalization. And the other side of it was the radicalization of the Salafi type of Islam, which was sort of divorcing from the local Sufi ideology, which was also disallowing people to go to shrines and mausoleums. So there's two long graves, and this is really potent. And I've written about this, but not in this manner. So there's this one big mountain in the capital city of Srinagar, which is near the Dal Lake, the famous Dal Lake. It's called Shankaracharya by the Hindu Pandits, and it's the local Muslims refer to as Takht Sulaiman, like the throne of Solomon. So there's that contestation on that hill as well. There are two long graves there. So under that de-radicalization project, that those were taken over by this local bureaucrat, and he kind of there were shrines there that people used to go to, but after they took over under the patronization of the local government, it actually became, they had a placard there. And when I was looking at the pictures that you were showing, it reminded me of those graves. They're also pretty much derelict in some sense, but there are also these placards and signs and incense and all of that. So it's really interesting how the local Muslims are they are pitted against each other, but then it also suffices the overall rubric of how it's kind of also settling the overall nationalistic score.
Right. Right, right, yeah.
Yeah, is it okay if I jump in? Question for Shobana, actually. Thank you very much, both of you, actually, for your talks. I really appreciated them, although obviously what I work on is totally different in terms of time and space. Really interesting discussions. Shobana, being here in Southeast Asia, we have not necessarily Sufi shrines, which are contested in various ways, but forms of Islam which map very, very carefully to geographies which are much older, particularly various other types of sort of quote unquote Hindu / Buddhist geographies that are sometimes 1,000 years older. To what extent are we talking about, is it a Salafi push specifically that squeezes the Sufis? Are there other pressures aside from them and the Buddhist nationalists in terms of how they conceive of space in this way? And I'm wondering if, in particular, about like solidarities with other groups, shared spaces that they might find. And you find that, for example, here in Southeast Asia, where Sufi or other minority Muslim spaces become spaces of solidarity with other minoritarian groups.
Yeah, so the Kataragama one is quite fascinating, and I think part of the solidarity or pluralism that is sustained there is partly because it's more in the south and less so in the north where the war unfolded, and kind of, so I think regionalism here has like a role to play in terms of the demographics of certain communities and where these spaces are located. So Kataragama, for instance, is a huge complex that is shared by Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims. And when you go into this huge complex, essentially, there is a Hindu temple right at the front to Valiamma, to Murugan's partner. Then right beside it is to the mosque, and then that's to Hither. It's believed that in a cyclical, every 7 years, he kind of visits, and this is where the fountain of life is. And there's an actual fountain there, and subsequent many different Sufi shrines in there. And then the Buddhist temple. What's interesting is one of the saints that's entombed in Kataragama, known as Palkuri Bawa, so a Bawa that drinks milk. There's a story of how they found him. There was a cow that was giving him milk, and that's how he got his name. He's entombed in the mosque in the Muslim area, but his slippers and icons are in the Buddhist temple. And so when I was even there was a Buddhist monk who had come to the Muslim shrine just to kind of offer veneration and put money into the till. And even I was surprised, because my perception of the space has often been a site of like very delicate, but like just communal violence. So those spaces do exist. And when they do exist, I think there's kind of a delicate way in which it's sustained. And I think part of the operation here is that this is your space, and this is your space, kind of in a broader complex. Dr. Jilani is tricky because even though it's an open air hermitage site, the use of archaeology to claim legitimacy of the site, to say that this is historically, the Buddhist presence here predates the Muslim presence here. So we need to remove all the Muslim buildings and all the Buddhist sites, and a huge, Buddha statue needs to be built to say that this belongs to the Buddhist. So that rhetoric is like emerging, particularly in Dr. Jilani. And some of that has, probably unfolded in Adam's Peak now. Like if you're a Muslim pilgrim who goes up on pilgrimage, you'll probably get more resistance, and you wouldn't be so comfortable praying up there, right? Even though there's this huge story of Adam and Muslim presence, and which has been documented, like I said, with Ibn Battuta and other folks as well. So I think it's the Salafi tendency is coming from of a more recent turn in the last few decades, and a result of growing economic ties to the Gulf states. It's just labor movement, right? That's going, especially between places in the East, connecting to the Gulf states, and then also to South Asia. And I think that's bringing in a lot of money, that's influencing the construction of schools, that's rising to a particular education, and the returning of Muslims who have gone to Saudi Arabia to study and have come back and said, well, these things are not things that we should be doing, which is influencing dress, schooling, all of this stuff, right? So I think that's one, but that coincides with broader kind of reality of what's happening. Muslims are also don't see themselves belonging in a nation state that's actively trying to marginalize them, both violently and through other structural systems. So in that context, you will find affinity to a global community that affirms your identity that you are Muslim. So I think it's, it's a catch-22, right? As you are being marginalized, you're then therefore going to identify in these ways that's going to further marginalize you, right? And I think Sufis in some ways using the language that Athar was saying is just there's this double marginalization that's going on, right? There's a precarity in the sense of certain identities that are colliding that result in like a delicate positionality. And I see that kind of unfolding with Sufi shrines, which I think my broader argument would be talking about, well, what does that say about the Muslim community in Sri Lanka, right? Yeah.
All right, I currently have at least one question for each of you. So let me start with Athar, and this is a reframing of a question that's in the chat. So Athar, as you know, there's a lot of ideas and myths and incorrect ideas about pre-modern Kashmir and religious demographic change that happened there. And those myths and stories are deployed in very politically volatile ways to make certain kinds of arguments for what kinds of religious demographic changes some people want to see in modern Kashmir and that sort of thing. So I was wondering if you could sort of comment on this, the use and abuse of history to justify the atrocities of the present.
So I saw the question. Is that the question you're referring to by Aditya Gupta?
Yes, as I said, it was a reframing.
Okay. So yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think I do want to talk about this. So one of the things that we really need to understand is that when I am talking about the demographic changes and settler colonialism, I'm also trying to, for myself, understand who I am as a Kashmiri Muslim, so to speak. And as I'm saying this, I want to say some of the human rights defenders in Kashmir, they're just they're third or fourth generation Muslims. Even though there was a moratorium on conversions during the Dogra regime, you couldn't convert any Pandit to being a Muslim. But there are still some families who are just like fourth or third generation Muslims. So there is a history of conversions there. Now, how did these conversions occur? I would suggest that there is a lot of history written around the conversion time, especially by one of the leading figures of Kashmiri history, so to speak, known as, he's passed now, with Professor Ishaq Khan. He actually talks about the two communities of Pandits and Muslims and how they share ethnic and cultural ties, and how around 11th century they start around the issues of casteism, ritualism, schisms, they start breaking up. And at that time, he calls it, just want to look for that quote, he calls it, especially the Kashmiri society during the medieval times, when you have the missionaries also coming in, undergoing a crisis of what may be described as human sociality versus Brahmanic particularism. And it's also important for us to know that most of the Kashmiri Pandits right now, they're all high caste Brahmins, the Saraswat Brahmins as they were already known at that time. So most of the Muslim majority that you see, they were the ones who thought that the potential of equality, they saw the potential of egalitarian Islam. So when I'm talking about Kashmir being dominantly Muslim right now, I'm not negating Kashmir's history of being Saraswat Brahmins or being animistic, being Buddhists and suffering those caste and religious atrocities that they were going through in between. And we also have two very iconic figures of that time. One in the icon of the mother Lal Ded, who was a poetess during that time, and also a mystic, a spiritualist. She was a Saraswat Brahmin by caste and birth. And she was also a poet. And her spiritual heir, who was a Muslim child, also a child of second generation convertees, who's also known as the standard bearer of Kashmir. And he was a Muslim, and he was of the Rishi order. Again, when you think about the Rishis it's a Sanskrit word. It's an order of monks, and I don't want to go, it's a separate discussion, but that's the order he founded. And he had many Pandit or slash what is now called as Hindus, because at that time they were not called as Hindus. They were still Saraswat Brahmins and other denominations. And he had an order filled with people who were convertees. So when I think about this as an anthropologist, I'm not negating those histories. I'm not negating the history of conversions. I'm not negating the history of Brahmanism, history of Buddhism. But I'm also not negating of what Kashmir is now and what Kashmiris want to be in this moment. So it's a matter of where do we want to start taking stock. There is a historical stock to be taken. I mean, do we go that far back and talk about the conversions done by different dynasties who came in from Central Asia or the missionaries, or do we want to talk about the current moment? And I think that's my personal goal as well, because anthropology doesn't force me to think about time periods in that manner. I'm not a historian, but I do think that we need to think about Kashmir in a much more expansive manner. There was a time, and I'm writing a play on this topic, there was a time in Kashmir when there would have been a mother who was cooking for a son who had converted to Islam and one who was still a Pandit, and she herself was undecided. So I think we need to contend with those histories minus what's happening outside. I think that we need to create a little bubble to think about that, and fiction and different creative genres do give us that grace. Maybe history doesn't, maybe anthropology doesn't, but I think that's where I find my, and I don't want to, and when I think about Kashmiri movement as of now, I mean, I'm not trying to exculpate the early militant movement or even the government of India camouflaging as a government, as politics of democracy, and not being the occupation it is. I think, I don't think as Kashmiri Muslims or even Kashmiri Hindu Pandits, there is nothing to apologize for the histories or the changes that people have made as far as the religions are concerned and which egalitarian system they want to follow, or the potential of certain egalitarian religions, so to speak. How they flourish and flower, we don't know. But Kashmiris, as far as I know, they have always in different histories tried to subscribe to what they thought was the most just. And that's how I kind of like see it. So I don't know if I answered the question, but I'm myself thinking through these things. But I think even looking at the history of where I'm sitting right now, there's multiple levels of genocides, and from whose vantage do I look at India, the US democracy? Do I look at it from the First Nations? It doesn't seem like a democracy when we change our vantage. Do I look at it from the vantage of the white dominant majority? Then it might be a system that's democratic. And I think it's not only a Kashmir or an India problem. I think it's a world problem that we are facing right now. And if we don't have answers for this in the most honest and genuine manner, I think we're just kind of like, trying to reinvent the wheel where there's nothing to reinvent. And for me personally, I feel like unless and until as Kashmiris, we don't contend with the histories of who Kashmiris have been in the past and why they changed the systems. I mean, it's always like when you talk to a Kashmiri, they're like, oh, Islam did not come with the sword. But then there are other narratives as well. So I think every bit of this history needs to be owned. And we have to do a collective exorcism and detox and collective saging of our histories. How that's going to be and who is going to take what part of that, I don't know. But this is kind of like what I'm thinking right now. And I don't think I'm out to exculpate the Muslim population, or I'm unseeing the injustice that has happened across board. But I'm also trying to contend with the current moment where Kashmiri Muslims are at the receiving end, and they do want to adhere to their Muslimness in this moment.
Thank you. That was a beautiful answer. So turning now to the past, this is a question for Nicholas coming from Daniel Morgan. So Daniel notes that there's really interesting parallels between Nicholas's and Shobana's talks about how different spaces and sites of death have the capacity to upend social hierarchies. And so then the question for Nicholas and Shobana, I'll come back to you, don't worry, is what happens later? Right? I mean, the Vinaya texts are relatively early. Do these practices disappear in later / modern Buddhism? What are your thoughts?
Great. Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you for the question. I don't know. I mean, the history of Buddhist studies and Indology has just once you move before the modern period, tends to erase the question of caste. It's just not there very often. What I've tried to do in this document is do a first step, basically, in showing some evidence of the presence of these figures. And I think that they existed relatively autonomously from what we now think of as a system. In fact, probably saying it was a system is not accurate, either in the period that we're talking about, turn of the Common Era. As far as I can tell, all the way through the first millennium, we're not talking about a system. We're talking about a set of relations among communities that are often fairly distinct from one another, autonomous from one another. And it's hard, as far as I can tell, in the first millennium to talk about hegemonic relations. Now, Buddhism disappears largely as a structuring phenomenon in religious life in South Asia in the 13th, 14th century. 13th, 14th centuries, it's there in the north, but for much of South Asia, you don't see this, you don't see that much influence. But during the first millennium itself, as far as I can tell, the hegemonic power of Brahmanical systems of control, including regarding caste, purity, etc., I don't see any evidence for it so far at all. And to me, this is fascinating, and it sheds a lot of light on what we might think about for the second millennium too, in terms of caste relations, not just in the Buddhist context, but across religious contexts. Can we really talk about a system of domination that looks something like the colonial period? I think certainly not. And so I think what I'm looking at in the early Buddhist context may actually become a paradigm for thinking about intercommunal relations, not as one of hegemonic domination by a Brahmanical community or a set of Brahmanical communities over everyone else, but rather relatively autonomous communities operating in relationship to one another, without those kind of hegemonic forces at play, and with the kind of reversals that go on, whereby impure spaces become spaces of power, and not thinking absolutely about purity as putting you at the bottom, impurity as being a kind of leverage point for thinking about entrepreneurial power relations among religious ascetics, sadhus, yogis of various types, whereby it becomes a lever for mobility within the broader society. So at any rate, yeah, that's what I would hope for thinking about later periods. But right now, there's no evidence that I have beyond the first few centuries of the Common Era.
All right. And then Shobana, we have sort of two sets of questions for you. And I'm going to start with a set of questions asked by Rutika Gandhi. And so she is someone who is interested in space and sacred spaces. And so she wants to know about mapping, right? And how are the different spaces that you talked about mapped, given that they're politicized? I mean, or how are they sort of addressed and demarcated on government city maps? And she also asks about the spatial memories surrounding these sites.
So I haven't looked at all of the government city maps. I've looked at some. And like, I mean, even if you go to like Google Maps or something like that, you'll notice that some of these spaces are just listed as like masjids, like mosques, because that's like the closest like language that is available. So that will be something I'd have to kind of look into. So I don't have a direct answer for that. One of the things I could say is with the whole Dr. Jalani situation, which is ongoing, when I was there in 2013, the army was there enacting as archaeologists, kind of destroying the place, but doing archaeology. And I went back with a colleague of mine who we were writing a paper. And when we went back, and I think we were there in 2016, there were plaques, boards everywhere that were in Sinhala and Tamil and in English explaining what the significance of the site was, along with an archaeology office with an expert who could give you kind of a sense of the history of the space. And so there's like efforts to, I would say, maybe curate this space in terms of talking about its history, namely that is, Kurugala is a Buddhist heritage site, and there was later presence of Sufis and what the space means and kind of that narrative that's constructed. So some of the bigger shrines, you'll see that. And Adams Peak, for instance, doesn't necessarily, there's a lot of shrines, Buddhist shrines, Chinese, Japanese shrines all along the pathway leading up, right? It's kind of a really big transnational spot. And so these are things kind of just marked as, this is Adams Peak. These are the different spaces there. And when you go to the top of the mountain, which it took me like 4 hours to climb the mountain, it's there's a Buddhist temple that's at the top, right? And that's kind of the point of access. So some of those are just legible as these spaces. The memory question is an important one, and I thank you for that, because that's something I think a lot about. So when I do go to local smaller shrines that are not often mapped, and you kind of get to them by talking to people in local communities who drive you there, and then they go to those spaces. The challenge with that one is that because the war, the nearly 3-decade war, disrupted everything and displaced people, internally displaced people, knowledge of those spaces are displaced with the communities that originally existed there. Right. And so when you do go to communities or you go talk to people, if they're people sitting in front of their houses, I would go ask them, like, do you know about this place? Do you know who's buried there? Most of them will say, like, in the olden days, like, we heard that this happened, but the people who lived here before would have known, and they're now gone. We don't know where they are. They're either still in IDP camps or they're in all these other places. So I think the war has also actively played a role in disrupting kind of the knowledge and memory of some of these spaces, which I think will add to some of the challenge of the research that I'm doing. Some people know some of these narratives, a lot of other people don't know. And so I think the memory issue is one that I'll need to reflect on a little bit more, especially against the ways in which it's kind of curated by the nation state. The other problem is I've been in a lot of conversations with scholars about like documenting and archiving. The challenge in terms of archiving and making this kind of itinerary of archives public is that you're also just giving information about where all these sites are to people who, and therefore can attract kind of further violence to these sites, right? And so that for me is also like an ethical issue. Like if we do go about and folks want to make these sites heritage sites or want to archive them and memorialize them in some capacity or document them and have that documentation publicly available in a context in a nation state where things always feel like it's in the brink of violence, communal violence, destruction of sacred spaces and things like that. Do you then, like, how do you negotiate kind of that information and how do you put it out there? There's Facebook groups now that take to archiving some of these sacred spaces and documenting some of these stories, but these Facebook groups are also documenting how this shrine got destroyed and that shrine got destroyed. And, so there's a lot of that going on as well. So I do have a bit of an ethical dilemma of trying to reflect on what is the role of the researcher in this capacity in terms of documenting and archiving these sites, what does it mean to apply to the government for heritage sites for these spaces and making sure that it's fully like under the protection of the government, but that's not necessarily a good thing in this context either, right? So I think your question, which I super appreciate, has a lot of features which I don't have all the answers to, but it's kind of signaling to some of the bigger questions that I'm dealing with. So thank you for that.
And Anna, you had a comment on this. Do you want to?
It was just a comment that sort of expands on some of the points that were raised that in other contexts, in India in particular, about strategies of renaming and erasing other identities when they're plural identities attributed to sites, using street signage and mapping as a technique of definition to essentially obfuscate the possibilities of multiple identifications, because that obviously goes against the contemporary narratives that need to be affirmed by the impossibility of any either the presence of Muslims in general or of any history of coexistence. All of that seems to be systematically on a number of levels being erased. And I appreciate the notion of how this is being worked out in social media as a strategy for both remembering, but also the challenge of then highlighting and bringing attention to places that then, which is something that hopefully I'll talk about tomorrow. So the more we talk about it, are we actually
Right.
intensifying the dynamics that we're so anguished by?
Yeah. No, that's like a huge fear of mine. And I don't know what our responsibility as researchers are in that. Yeah. And the linguistic thing is exactly goes back to what the issue is that most of the signage goes back into Sinhala. And then occasionally you'll see street signs or places where Tamil is transliterated wrong. And so it's just seen as, oh, it's an accident. But often that really marks as an effort to start like disrupting the Tamil language, and then therefore as a means to say, well, it's right in Sinhala, it's not, that street name is just off by one letter, it's an easy mistake. But when you start piling it up in the context of the broader politics, then you start realizing some of these issues around the violence continues linguistically or spatially and culturally in other ways as well, right? Yeah.
All right, and I think next up is Rohit, who is exercising his deserved rights as organizer to ask a couple of questions. You're muted.
Yeah, you're unmuted is, I think, the line of 19, 20, 21, and 22. Well, thank you for this riveting panel, and I'm going to try not to make a fool of myself in like several different disciplines. So I have a question for Shobhana and one for Athar. So Shobhana, I was just wondering are there any sort of new narratives being constructed around these shrines? And I'm just thinking of what I have in mind here is an example from Delhi. Like several years ago, I was visiting Delhi. My parents lived there, then they moved. And I have a friend who knows Old Delhi like the back of his hand. So we went to Firozshah Kotla, which is a historical site. And it's, there's all kinds of interesting contestations. There are these legends that if you put sugar and flour, these ants will come there and then they will fulfill your wishes and so on. And Hindus and Muslims go there. Now, we were in one spot and then there was this Maulvi who was praying and he had just put up a little structure. It was 3 feet by 3 feet. He said it's a mosque and he claimed that this is a mosque that went back to the time of Firozshah. And my friend said that this is something that started happening where you will have these structures created here as a way of claiming Muslim space. And then it sort of becomes this debate about, is this owned by the Archaeological Survey of India or is this owned by the Muslim community? And so that's one kind of, so there's been a lot of these kind of stories. And one way to see it is it's kind of, pushing back against the encroachment on Muslim identity and the reframing of Muslim identity or the erasure of Muslim identity that's happening outside. So I was just wondering if there are any of these retroactive stories around these shrines. And then Athar, the question I had was a couple of questions about I think several years ago I read this Suvir Kaul wrote a piece about how the term Azadi was mobilizing actually the rhetoric of the Indian anti-colonial struggle against the Indian state. So I was just wondering, what resonances Azadi might have taken on, especially in the light of what the Modi government has done. And then the second question I had was that, when you think of this demographic change, the first thing I thought of was what's happening in Tibet with Han Chinese populations being actually moved in there. That got coverage in the New Yorker. So I just wonder, like, what happens with the larger conversation about Kashmir? Is it precisely because it's been framed as this, Islamist, jihadist, etc., Inish movement that it doesn't get the same kind of recognition? So those are my questions.
Okay, so let me take the maybe, sorry, no, go ahead. I completely forgot that there were two sets of questions. Sorry about that.
I'll be
Shobana, you
super.
take the first one. It's okay.
Yeah, I'll be super quick. I don't know that there's so much of the smaller shrines that I'm looking at. A lot of it is not as much as like retroactively altering the narratives as much as people just don't know who they are. Like I go to the little villages, I go to talk to people and they like, we know there's somebody buried here and maybe they're Persian, but we don't know what their story is. Or we know that she's a woman and she's very important and people come and venerate, but we don't know who she is, right? And so sometimes in those moments, the stories get fabricated because then people just say like, oh, we think this or we think that. And for me, I'm really fascinated about that as like a disruption of kind of maybe narrative and the kind of the construction of new narratives around these figures that a lot of people don't know about. Aside from the major shrines around Dr. Jilani, which has been one of the most politicized ones, I think the other minor ones, a lot of it is not like a move to kind of the process that you're describing as much as kind of loss of the narrative of like, we don't know who this person is and it's just kind of lost, right? So I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Thank you. So let me answer the second question first. Or maybe the resonances of Azadi, of course. You know, if I remember correctly, there's a couple of articles by Suvir, and one of the books, Graves, I forget the full name of the book, but it's of Graves and something very recent, 2016, 2017 by Duke Press. He does talk about Kashmiri movement. Can be seen and has resonances with the 20th century anti-colonial movements. So he does frame the idea and the rhetoric and the slogan of Azadi that's happening inside Kashmir within that framework. So I actually, in some places, even in my book and articles, I kind of like start from that ideology when I think about Kashmiri Azadi. And also how it evolved and how it was framed in the late 19th century Kashmir as well, as it began to, even though at that time it was still living under indentured slavery of the last monarchy. And it also had a Hindu-Muslim angle at that point in time, which I really find troubling, that both sides behave as if there was this only the ideal of syncretic culture, which I think has its roots in spiritual culture rather than the political culture. So this example, like my grandfather, when he would talk about his Pandit friends, he was a paralegal. He had paralegal Pandit friends. And it's very hard to find Muslim paralegals in that particular time and era because most Muslims were not literate. Majority of them were in indentured slavery, so to speak. And it's very hard to find such people. But through those conversations and then some other conversations that I had specifically around this issue, I find the overlaps were mostly in the spiritual traditions rather than in the political traditions, because the political trajectories are completely divergent as the Pandit elites are finding more patronage, and Muslim elites, a small percent of them are finding patronage under these different courts and different dynasties. Most Muslims throughout have been in indentured slavery. So it kind of, to me, it's very troubling that most of us do not pay attention to those dichotomies. Most of us adhere to this norm of Kashmiriyat, which is being deconstructed by a lot of scholars, but at the same time, not in the manner, not going back to those historical moments, because we feel as if we go back to those historic moments, we kind of will hold one or the other culpable. And I think that's something that we really have to divest of, that I'm not responsible for my history in that sense. I'm a product of my history and I have to do better with the history I have. So I think Suvir doesn't really differ too much with the iterations of Azadi that many who I mentioned earlier. Azadi is primarily fighting Indian occupation, and I think that's very common to all the iterations of Azadi across board for Kashmiris. And after 2019, I think it's very hard for India to really find real collaborators inside Kashmir, because most of them are really at this moment thinking in anti-India terms, even the collaborators. So I think the primary line of action for Azadi, or the slogan, the rhetoric, is anti-India movement against India. That's kind of the primary thing. And then there are the iterations, whether you want freedom and then you want to accede to Pakistan, that is a faction. And we also have to consider the history there. When we think about Azad Kashmir, we are only taking the Indian narrative into cognizance. We are not taking into cognizance the fact that these are people who actually fought at that time for their Azadi. They called it Azad Kashmir Forces. And the name is not in vain. Calling it Azad Kashmir is Azadi from sort of like the clientist regime that is still in power in some ways in Indian administered Kashmir. So I think we have to pay attention to what is the relation of Kashmiris and Pakistan without treating it as a deviancy or an anomaly within the rubric of Indian nationalism. There is a relationship there. There's a very strong relationship there. Even if Kashmiris seek independence, they are for Pakistan in some sense, affective sense, emotional sense. And the other thing we also have to understand is when we think about Azad Kashmir, most of it is subsumed under Pakistan. Even if there are Azad Kashmiri militants, they're seen as Pakistani militants. And I think that's they're subsumed in that manner. And I think that that's very important. And also to pay attention to nomenclature. Line of control is not a boundary. It's not a border. People might call it border or border in different nomenclatures, and vernacular languages, but I don't think we can kind of like afford to do that, because that really sends us away from how Kashmiri sees this and also from what the historical reality is. And then you asked about the layers of conversation around this. And again, I speak from having lived under the regime in Indian administered Kashmir. India did, for the longest possible time, it did have a sway on the international narrative. That's why right now people don't think of Kashmir as an international issue. And I always try to correct this idea that since 2019, Kashmir has been internationalized, because I think it's always been an international issue. It's re-internationalized. It's not been internationalized since 2019, because that's what it was from 1947 onwards, especially 1948, when India took it to the United Nations. And I think Cold War and other geopolitical realities put this multi-layered invisibilization, but especially the politics of democracy that has been played inside Indian administered Kashmir, where electoral politics, with the help of client regimes, it was weaponized to an extent that if we hold elections in a disputed territory, which in 1951, United Nations asks India, like, how are you holding these elections in a disputed territory? And they say that this is for governance, plebiscite is still in effect. So I think that is also one of the reasons that the world did buy that this is a democratic India ruling and governing this disputed territory, which slowly is also being integrated into its geo-body through democracy. And the client regimes, the rigged elections, they came in very handy. But I think it's very important for us to know that in no decade, Kashmiris have been quiet. In no decade since 1940s, they haven't been quiet. In every decade, there has been an iteration of Azadi and a movement in some form. And that only comes through Kashmiri literature, which wasn't when if I'm talking about
Athar, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm going to have to ask you to take 30 seconds to wrap up because we're over time.
I think that's about it, and I think that's how India got away with creating this narrative of Kashmiri terrorism and completely subsuming the resistance movement.
Thanks,
well,
thanks.
I think that Azadi in Kashmiri literature is an excellent place for us all to end. So please join me in thanking our panelists. This was a fantastic panel. I enjoyed it very much. We reconvene tomorrow, same time, same place. So starting at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, you all have the Zoom link. And we have two fantastic panels. We like taking credit for Rohit's work, but that's okay. There are two fantastic panels up tomorrow: the politics of knowledge and transmission, and then religious authority, affect, and solidarity. So take care. I'll see you all tomorrow.
I'll hang on here. Thanks so much, Audrey. Thanks, everyone.